Hello, dolphin families. Welcome to another edition of Bedtime Stories with Mrs. Moodry. This week we have a story about a girl, Annabelle, who finds a box of colorful yarn, and she starts knitting sweaters for everyone in her town, and she never runs out of yarn. She even knits sweaters for animals and some other crazy things. But when a greedy man tries to steal her magical yarn, something surprising happens. So this book shows how creativity and kindness can bring color and joy to the world. It is called Extra Yarn, and let's dive in and take a look. Extra Yarn, written by Mac Barnett. On a cold afternoon in a cold little town, where everywhere you looked was either white of snow or the black of soot from chimneys, Annabelle found a box filled with yarn of every color. So she went home and knit herself a sweater. And when Annabelle was done, she had some extra yarn. So she knit a sweater for Mars too. But there was still extra yarn. Did you notice the leash is the yarn? It's almost like it connects them. And when Annabelle and Mars went for a walk, Nate pointed and laughed and said, "You two look ridiculous." "You're just jealous," said Annabelle. "No, I'm not," said Nate. But it turned out he was. And even after she made a sweater for Nate and his dog, and for herself and for Mars, she still had extra yarn. At school, Annabelle's classmates could not stop talking about her sweater. "Quiet!" shouted Mr. Norman. "Quiet, everyone! Annabelle, that sweater of yours is a terrible distraction. I cannot teach with everyone turning around to look at you." "Then I'll knit one for everyone," Annabelle said, "so they won't have to turn around." "Impossible," said Mr. Norman. "You can't." But it turned out she could, and she did, even for Mr. Norman. And when she was done, Annabelle still had extra yarn. So she knit sweaters for her mom and dad, and for Mr. Pendleton and Mrs. Pendleton, and for Dr. Palmer, and for little Louie. She made sweaters for everyone, except Mr. Crabtree, who never wore sweaters or even long pants, and who would stand in his shorts with the snow up to his knees. "No sweater for me, thanks," said Mr. Crabtree. So she made Mr. Crabtree a hat, and even then Annabelle still had extra yarn. She made sweaters for all the dogs and all the cats, and for other animals too. Soon Annabelle will run out of yarn. But it turned out she didn't. So Annabelle made sweaters for things that didn't even wear sweaters. Things began to change in that little town. Look how colorful it is now. Even the houses have sweaters. News spread of this remarkable girl who never ran out of yarn, and people came to visit from around the world to see all the sweaters and to shake Annabelle's hand. One day, an archduke, who was very fond of clothes, sailed across the sea and demanded to see Annabelle. "Little girl," said the archduke, "I would like to buy that miraculous box of yarn, and I'm willing to offer you $1,000,000. "No, thank you," said Annabelle, who was knitting a sweater for a pickup truck. The archduke's mustache twitched. $2,000,000, he said. Annabelle shook her head. "No, thanks." $10,000,000, shouted the archduke. "Take it or leave it." "Leave it," said Annabelle. "I won't sell the yarn." And she didn't. So that night the archduke hired 3 robbers to break into Annabelle's house, and they stole the box, and they took it to the archduke, who set off across the snow and sailed over the sea back to his castle. The archduke put on his favorite song and sat in his best chair. Then he took out the box, and he lifted its lid, and he looked inside. Uh-oh. There's nothing there. His mustache quivered. It shivered. It trembled. The Archduke hurled the box out of his window and shouted, "Little girl, I curse you with my family's curse. You will never be happy again." But he threw out the box from his window, and it landed on a piece of ice. And then here it is, sailing across the ocean. Right back to Annabelle. It turned out she was still happy, even though the Archduke tried to take her happiness away. Do you think there's still yarn in there? When we turn the page, we see even more animals and the tree with the sweaters. I think there's yarn in there for Annabelle. And that's Elfin Families is Extra Yarn. Now, I love this story because it reminds us to spread kindness, creativity, and joy wherever we go. It reminds us to share what we have, either by sharing our talents or our time. It talks about being creative and bringing joy to others. But most importantly, it talks about staying positive. And like Annabelle, we can focus on spreading good and positive energy even when things don't go as planned. But most importantly, it reminds us that we make the world a brighter and happier place just by being ourselves. So, thanks for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next week.